The first snow of the season had just begun to blanket the ground as I arrived at the cabin. It was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. This isolation was exactly what after the chaos of my divorce and the suffocating monotony of my job. I wanted nothing more than to escape the world and find peace and solitude. The rental ad had promised a cozy retreat, and as I stepped inside, I was pleased to see it was everything I had hoped for. Rustic but comfortable, with a crackling fireplace and large windows that framed the sprawling wilderness outside. The first night was uneventful. I spent the evening unpacking, making a modest dinner, and settling into the quiet. The stillness was almost too much at first, an overwhelming absence of sound. No cars in the distance, no hum of electronics, just the occasional creak of the cabin as the wind pushed against its wooden walls. It was a refreshing change. As I lay in bed that night, I stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the trees, and felt the first flicker of contentment I'd had in months. It wasn't until the second night that I heard the noises. It started with a faint tapping on the windows. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a branch, perhaps the wind playing tricks. But as the hours stretched on, the tapping became more rhythmic, almost deliberate. It was coming from the living room. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly, my heart beginning to race. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the flashlight I had packed and tiptoed to the living room. The beam of light swept across the furniture, the fireplace, and finally the window. Nothing. No branches nearby, no signs of anything that could have caused the sound. Shaking my head, I laughed at myself for being so jumpy and went back to bed. The next morning, I found the marks. They were on the front door, long, jagged scratches, as though someone had dragged a sharp tool down its surface. I crouched to inspect them, running my fingers over the grooves. They were too deep to have been made by an animal, and their placement was unnervingly precise. I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been made intentionally. Unease settled over me as I stared at the door, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the previous renter had caused them, and I simply hadn't noticed before. I decided to explore the woods that afternoon, hoping some fresh air would clear my mind. The snow crunched under my boots as I ventured further from the cabin, the cold air biting at my face. The forest was dense, the trees towering and skeletal in their winter nakedness. About a half-mile in, I found something strange. Wooden carvings dangling from the branches. They were crudely made, each one resembling a face twisted in an expression of fear or pain. I counted at least a dozen, all swaying gently in the wind. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned back toward the cabin, suddenly eager to leave the woods behind. That night, the sounds returned, louder this time, scratching, tapping, and faint whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew better. I lay awake in bed, clutching the blankets to my chest, too afraid to investigate. The whispers grew louder as the hours passed, a garbled cacophony of unintelligible words. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I found more scratches on the door that day, fresher and deeper than before. I called the rental agency to report it, but the call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I moved a heavy chair in front of the door and bolted all the locks. Whatever was out there wasn't getting in. That night, I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, and far heavier than any animal could make. My heart pounded as I sat frozen in bed, the sound growing closer with each step. I clutched the flashlight tightly, praying it would stop. Then came the knock, a single, deafening knock that echoed through the cabin. I held my breath, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't. Instead, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. They were coming from inside the house. I don't remember much about that night. Adrenaline and fear overtook me, and I must have blacked out at some point. When I woke, the cabin was eerily silent. The chair I had placed in front of the door was toppled over, and the front door was ajar, snow blowing in through the opening. I bolted outside, desperate to see what had happened, but there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no signs of intrusion, just the endless forest staring back at me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the flashlight and a kitchen knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. The next morning, I packed my things and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin stood silently against the backdrop of the snowy woods, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the window, a shadow, watching me leave. It's been years since that winter, but I still think about that cabin. Sometimes I hear whispers when I'm alone, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And sometimes, late at night, I see scratches on my apartment. The idea of a Christmas getaway with my closest friends seemed perfect. We had rented a secluded cabin on a frozen lake, miles away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The brochure painted it as a winter wonderland, snow-covered trees, a glistening frozen lake, and the promise of peace and relaxation. We were 6 in total: myself, Emma, her boyfriend Mark, Sarah, Alex, and Jess. We were a tight-knit group, eager to unwind and celebrate the holidays in our own little winter haven. The drive was long and uneventful, the scenery transitioning from urban sprawl to endless stretches of snow-covered wilderness. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen lake. The cabin was beautiful, exactly as described. A cozy 2-story structure, with a roaring fireplace, wooden interiors, and large windows overlooking the vast, icy expanse of the lake. The locals in the nearby town had been friendly but cryptic. As we stocked up on supplies, the cashier at the general store hesitated when we mentioned the cabin. "You be careful out there," he had said, his voice low and wary. "That lake's got a history." When pressed, he simply shook his head and muttered something about leaving before dark. We laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town superstition. The first evening was magical. We cooked a big dinner, played board games, and shared stories by the fire. The stars outside were dazzling, their light reflecting off the ice like a million tiny mirrors. It was the kind of peaceful, idyllic night you'd see in a postcard. But as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was too quiet. Not the comforting quiet of solitude, but an oppressive stillness, as if the world outside had gone completely still. I woke in the middle of the night to an odd sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, mournful singing. At first, I thought it was Emma, who had a habit of humming to herself when she couldn't sleep. But the sound wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from the lake. I crept out of bed and moved to the window, peering out at the ice. In the pale moonlight, the lake seemed to stretch on forever, a sheet of frozen glass, and then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the lake. It was hard to make out any detail from the distance, but the figure was pale and unmoving, its head tilted slightly as if listening to the song. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The next morning, I told the others what I'd seen, but they brushed it off. "It's probably just the wind," Mark said. "Or maybe some local playing a prank." I wanted to believe him, but the unease in my gut refused to go away. We spent the day exploring the area, trekking through the woods and skating on the lake. It was during one of our outings that we found something unsettling. A hole in the ice, surrounded by jagged cracks, as if something had burst through from below. Nearby, half buried in the snow, was an old rusted sled and a scattering of children's toys, faded and broken. The sight was eerie, but we convinced ourselves it was nothing more than remnants of an old accident. That night, the singing returned. This time, it was louder, echoing across the lake like a ghostly lullaby. The others heard it too, and we gathered in the living room, peering nervously out the windows. "It's probably someone messing with us," Alex said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. And then the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the moonlight reflecting off the snow. We scrambled for flashlights and huddled together, trying to stay calm. That's when we heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and crunching through the snow. They circled the cabin, pausing occasionally as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. Mark, ever the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, shouting into the darkness. "Whoever's out there, this isn't funny," he yelled. The rest of us watched anxiously from the window as he scanned the tree line with the flashlight. There was nothing. He turned back toward the cabin, but just before he reached the porch, the light caught something, a pale humanoid figure standing at the edge of the lake. The next moments were chaos. Mark sprinted back inside, slamming the door behind him, his face as white as a sheet. "There's someone out there," he panted. The singing grew louder. We spent the rest of the night barricaded in the living room, the fireplace our only source of light. The singing eventually faded, but the sense of dread lingered, a suffocating weight pressing down on us. The next morning, Jess was gone. Her bed was empty, her coat and boots missing. A set of footprints led from the cabin to the lake, stopping abruptly at the hole in the ice. Panic set in as we searched the surrounding area, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. Desperate, we decided to leave. But when we tried to start the car, it wouldn't budge, the engine dead despite being in perfect condition the day before. We were trapped. The final night was the worst. The singing returned, accompanied by scratching at the windows. The pale figure appeared again, closer this time, its face still obscured, but its presence undeniable. One by one, the others began acting strangely. Sarah started muttering to her. Alex refused to leave the corner of the room, and Mark sat staring blankly at the fireplace, unresponsive to anything we said. And then the figure entered the cabin. The door never opened. It was simply there, standing in the middle of the room, pale, gaunt, faceless. It radiated an aura of cold so intense it burned. I don't remember much after that, just screams, darkness, and the overwhelming feeling of sinking, as though being dragged into the depths of freezing water. I woke up weeks later in a hospital. A group of hikers had found me wandering near the edge of the forest, half frozen and delirious. The authorities said there was no sign of the cabin or my friends, just an empty stretch of forest where the lake had once been. Sometimes late at night I hear the singing again. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. And when I close my eyes, I see the pale figure waiting for, standing on a frozen lake that no longer exists. The decision to spend Christmas at my family's old hunting cabin wasn't entirely my idea. My parents insisted it would be a great way to reconnect and rekindle the holiday spirit. It was remote, quiet, and surrounded by snow-covered pines, a winter postcard brought to life. My younger sister Lily was thrilled. I wasn't. The cabin had always unsettled me. Even as a child, I had felt something off about the place. The air was too still, the shadows too long, and the silence too heavy. But I didn't want to ruin the holiday for Lily, so I agreed. We arrived on Christmas Eve, just as the last light of the day was slipping behind the mountains. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered: weathered wood, a sagging porch, and windows that seemed to glare at you rather than welcome you. Inside, it was cold and musty, but my parents quickly set to work, making it feel cozy. Lily and I explored the cabin, poking around the old rooms and unpacking our things. The unease I'd felt as a child came rushing back as I walked through the familiar halls. That night, as we sat by the fire drinking cocoa, my dad told us the same story he always did about the cabin's history. Built by my great-grandfather, it had been passed down through generations, always serving as a holiday retreat. But this time, he added something new. There's a local legend, he said with a chuckle, about the silent watcher. Supposedly, if you're out here on a winter's night and the wind stops, you'll see him, just standing, staring. Lily laughed nervously, but I didn't. I'd heard whispers of this story before, though never from my father. My grandmother had mentioned it once, years ago, when she thought I wasn't. The silent watcher sees everything, and if you see him, he'll never leave you alone. I slept poorly that, the creaks and groans of the old cabin amplifying my. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound, a faint tapping on the window. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed. The sound came again, rhythmic, deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept to the window and peeked out. Nothing, just the dark expanse of the forest and the soft glow of moonlight on the snow. I told myself it was a branch swaying in the wind and crawled back into bed. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Christmas morning was a strange mix of joy and tension. My parents acted as though nothing was wrong, but Lily was unusually quiet. She kept glancing at the windows and fidgeting with her hands. I pulled her aside after breakfast. "What's wrong?" I asked. She hesitated before whispering, "I saw someone outside last night. I thought it was you, but it wasn't." My stomach dropped. "What did they look like?" She shook her head. I couldn't see their face. They were just standing there by the tree line watching. I didn't want to scare her, so I told her it was probably a trick of the shadows. But her words stayed with me. That evening, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The wind, which had been howling all day, suddenly stopped. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. My dad tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but even he seemed uneasy. As night fell, the tapping returned. This time it was louder and more insistent. It came from every window as though something or someone was circling the cabin. My dad grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. "There's nothing out here," he called back, but his voice wavered. I didn't believe him. Neither did Lily. The tapping turned to knocking, heavy and deliberate, rattling the windows and doors. My mom lit candles and whispered prayers under her breath, her usual skepticism replaced by fear. My dad blocked the door with the couch, and we all huddled in the living room, clutching each other as the sounds grew louder and more erratic. And then it stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. Then, from the window, we heard Lily's voice. "Let me in," it pleaded. "I'm cold." Lily was sitting right next to me. My dad shone the flashlight at the window, but there was nothing there. "It's a trick," he muttered, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than us. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, I'm scared." We didn't sleep that night. The whispers and knocks continued, growing more insistent as the hours passed. By dawn, the cabin was eerily quiet again, the oppressive silence returning. My parents decided we were leaving immediately. We packed in record time, throwing our belongings into bags and piling into the car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. Standing on the porch was a figure, pale and motionless, its face obscured. I blinked and it was gone. We never spoke of that Christmas again. My parents sold the cabin a few months later, refusing to answer any questions about why. Sometimes late at night, I hear faint tapping on my apartment window, even though I live on the fifth floor. And sometimes, when the wind stops, I feel a presence, silent, watching.